how are we defining death, right? Because when I just give a view of like what I think about the topic, and the death topic is one of my favorites,
Hmm.
morbidly. And if you were to ask me how would I define death, I don't know what I'd say. I mean, I guess I would immediately question, do we even do we even ever meet death? And you kind of touch on this in the book. It's like, and the thing is, my thoughts were aligned with yours as I was reading it. I was like, yeah, that's something I've actually like briefly was like, oh, that's kind of strange because everybody's like, or at least they assume the assumption is
Hmm.
death is some kind of event, right? And I actually wrote something about this kind of idea like a couple of years ago. I never actually like published it anywhere. Like I didn't, post it anywhere. But it was basically me just kind of discussing the idea that it's kind of a paradox, right? Death it seems as a paradox because like we never actually meet, like we never jump on a platform that is that is death, right?
No.
We never physically like get there. And as you say in the book, it's more dying. People experience dying, but not actually death in of itself. And I really appreciate that because I personally think that is entirely true. And I'm not even sure if death is genuinely an event. It's more, I don't even know how to finish the sentence. It seems to me a paradoxical reality. Yeah. Anyway, that's kind
Yeah.
of my thoughts. Just to give you kind of this understanding of and the audience like what I personally conceptualize death as. And do you have like this
Yeah.
definition that you work with, or like explain what you think about that?
Yeah. So to go to the state, I specifically referenced Blanchot when it comes to like we don't get to have death. I mean, there's other thinkers that do it, but Blanchot does it the most poetically, and I think he's just someone worth checking out just because of his very bizarre literary merit. But and that kind of comes from going through like the Heidegger tree. Dr. Ian Thompson is one of the main Heidegger scholars in North America, if not the world. Has given me a lot of inspiration on this topic, just taking his courses alone on Heidegger and Levinas. And he actually studied under both Dreyfus and Derrida. So more the Derrida direction I'm interested in than Dreyfus. But so there's been a lot of like influence from there. So where I get my definition of death from is very similar to where Heidegger gets his understanding of uh, demise slash perishing from, like the core of those two definitions. However, I do want to say this before I specify my own definition. I hope that my book works with any definition of death, right? Like I wanted it to be flexible for that reason. Like no matter what one thinks about death, I think even that like that definition is assumptive, right? Like the any I think definition of death is assumptive, no matter what one takes as their definition. For me, the definition of death is the ceasing of existence, right? Like that like one does not exist in any capacity. And I think you can already see by taking that definition, there's a lot of just maybe instinctual routes people could go to where like, oh, well, of course, like one cannot ever cease to exist, right? If you're in the Buddhist sense, well, you just always reincarnate. And it's like this, it's reincarnation in a monism, depending on your interpretation, right? This would also be the case for Spinoza monism without reincarnation, and the soul, if you're Christian, like you don't die because you continue to exist. So I think by using this personal definition, I think it's one that like a lot of people would like be like, oh, well, that makes sense. A lot of people, of course, would still disagree with, and they wouldn't be wrong for disagreeing with it necessarily. I think, as you said before, it's one of those terms like love that a lot of people struggle with. Although I think most people, when they come to define death, they think of it simply in the bodily form, and I think that's the main assumption that people make. I think my definition of death is outside of the norm, but I think it's still a definition that a lot of people could go, okay, I see where you're getting at.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, another question sort of pops up in my mind, which is, can we can we ever genuinely know what death is from an objective level? Because it seems to me that we're not even objective creatures.
Mhm.
So to suggest that we can know what death is objectively, I don't really like what Epicurus, what Epicurus said, and a lot of people like it, and a lot of people reference it. I don't think it's probably referenced in yours because it's a very famous quote,
Yeah,
and
it is.
it's worth referencing. Obviously,
It has to
it's
be
ahead
tackled.
of its
It's
time.
one of those.
Yeah, yeah, but I mean, I don't really like this idea that death, because it is imminent, there is no need to think about it. There's no need to be concerned. To me, that is very dismissive. And Epicurus's idea is it's intellectualizing the issue. And to me, from what I've learned from philosophy and also studying psychology, is that like we can intellectualize something so much that it doesn't actually resemble reality. So I think when we think about these kind of topics, we need to consider them from not only an intellectual category, but also an intuitive and realistic one. And so Epicurus basically saying, don't worry about death, it's imminent, who cares? I just that isn't satisfying to me. I just think that's a cop out. It's an
Well, it's a
intellectualization.
statement. It's also
Yeah.
a statement that could only come from someone who's thought a lot about death. Right. Like
Yeah.
it's funny because like only a statement with that much thought about death comes from someone thinking about death. Like there's an irony in the statement that actually until you brought it up, I hadn't even thought about. So yeah, like that's something that's kind of interesting there. Um, yeah, that's a good thought because honestly, like, yeah, he's almost being ironic. Like, hey, you don't, and then like it's the whole I forget what the parable or the full parable, but it's the monk that goes to the other monk, and he's like, yeah, I want to master something, and the monk tells him, all right, don't think about monkeys, and the guy, the monk that's like the student, like he's like, oh, that should be easy. I don't think about monkeys at all. And then he can't get monkeys out of his head. So like
Yeah.
Epicurus be like, oh, don't think about death. Like you just triggered thoughts about death. So it's there is kind of a irony to that.
Yeah. If anything, you should be saying like you should write a book about washing dishes or something to demonstrate that you shouldn't think about death, and that'd be like, but like he referenced it at the very end. It's like this is all about avoiding the issue. I mean, it's
Well,
something
that's
like
kind of what
that. It's
Confucius
yeah,
does. I mean, Confucius has some writings on death that are quite fascinating because Confucius, the way Confucius treats death is Confucius treats it almost like another ritual, right? He's very robotic, about death, as opposed to the Taoists of writings, which are much, I think, much more beautiful on death. For Confucius, it's like, okay, when I die, remember to put like, I mean, essentially his philosophy is like, remember when I die, make sure to like, like go to the shrine a certain number of times, have the proper right. Like and it's one of those things where it's like the only way Confucius could see living on is through like embodied earthly sort of rituals, and right, like he's grasping on his own forgetting sort of way. But I think you're right. It's one of those things where people want to avoid it, but it's one of those things like we also can't help thinking about either, right? Like Epicurus, by trying to not think about it, is thinking about it. Confucius, by trying to not think about it, is thinking about it, right? The Taoists, even in their quest for mortality, are thinking about death. Like it is one of those. This is one of those things that Heidegger is right about, right? If we take, death not as his sort of weird conflation, right? But if we just take it as like the common understanding, you know, most people act as beings towards death, right? We more readily think about dying than living quite often. This is something that's very common to the human condition, and I am no exception, clearly, by writing a book on it.